So, you know, the kill it or make it bonsai trope has some validity, but it's not the philosophy that I adhere to or encourage. There's one time that it's absolutely imperative that we do not prune. They're species that are like, oh no, scissors, he's going to touch our roots. Oh no, oh my, I'm healthy, but I'm just so fickle. And then you've got species that are like, heck yeah, cut everything off. I love this. I don't need limbs. I don't need roots. Yeah, let's do this. Okay, we're on. This is the first Q&A session as part of the DIY Bonsai Challenge. There's links down in the comments if you want to join along. But yeah, let's dive into the questions. A question from the Facebook group from Jeff Richardson. Hi Darren, glad to see you're back as I've missed your YouTube vids. Thank you. We're getting there. I've seen many, maybe too many videos on YouTube about bonsai, but I've yet to discover anything on cut paste. I know this may be a fairly drab subject, but I'm sure there's people who are unsure about which types. How much to use, when to use, do you remove? Wouldn't need to be a long video as I'm sure it's all fairly simple. Wound treatment. When we prune a tree, we effectively create a wound, and in some cases we want to enhance the wound and make it more woundy, make it into more of a feature. So we might carve it or allow it to rot somewhat naturally. Alternatively, we want to heal the wound so that it's impossible to tell that there was ever a pruning mark in the first place. Which approach you prefer depends on the tree or your particular aesthetic preferences. But in the case of healing the wounds, we've got some products that can help that. The reason we use these products is because it helps speed up the healing, so the live tissue closes around the dead exposed wound. But the main reason is actually to prevent or reduce the amount of air that can enter the vascular tissue. If you imagine our tree trunk or our branch is kind of like a drinking straw, and so the leaves are kind of sucking water up the straw. It's like when we have a drink, we put our lips around the straw to create a seal and then suck, and water or the juice comes up the straw and we drink it. Now imagine if you've taken a small chunk out of the side of the straw, you've pruned your tree. When you try to take a drink, air comes in through the hole, reducing the amount of water that can come up the straw. And the effect is almost identical in the tree. You've created an open wound. Air can slowly, it's much slower than a drinking straw, but air can enter the vascular system, creating an embolism, and that reduces the ability of the tree to draw water from the roots to and around that area, and that can lead to a larger wound than we would like and even die back below the wound. By sealing it, we reduce the amount of air that gets in and therefore reduce the likelihood of dieback, creating a bigger wound. So there's two sort of broad general types. We've got the liquid type and we've got the putty type of wound dressing. Just open these up so you can see. This one's a putty type. It's like a paste kind of a consistency, almost like a clay. There we go. And then we've got the liquid here. Welded it shut. And then this is more like a toothpaste consistency. In the clay / putty category, we've got two. We've got the green lid and we've got the white lid. The green one has a hormone and the white one doesn't. In the liquid category, I've got two that I use. We've got the Charismate or Calismate, and then whatever this one's called. These both contain a hormone. This one contains a stronger hormone or more hormone. This one contains a little bit less. I don't know what this is called. I'll put it in the comments so that you can search it. There are liquid products that don't contain the hormone. It's just that I happen to not bother with them. The putty type products I use for larger cuts. So generally speaking, if I've had to use the big cutters or a saw and it's created sort of a wound bigger than, I don't know, about the size of my fingernail or larger, I'll be using a putty. And then whether I use the hormone or the non-hormone depends on the species of tree and also the stage of development of the tree. Some species, like tridents, field maples, produce aggressive callus. So adding the hormone to it produces almost like an ugly amount of callus. It kind of bubbles up or bulges and doesn't look aesthetically pleasing. So for particularly aggressive species, I'll use the putty that doesn't contain the hormone. For everything else, conifers, slower healing deciduous, everything else I use the green. In fact, I've run out of the green. I've still got loads of the white left, and that'll tell you my preference. The paste, is this paste? The liquid versions I use on smaller pruning marks on trees that are in bonsai pots, so they take a little bit longer to heal. And I also use it on cracks, anywhere where the bark might have split from bending or just general damage. Small wounds, I'll use the liquids. I'll also favour this one with the higher content of hormone for species that are particularly slow to heal. So Cotoneaster, Pyracantha, Quince, species that are very slow. I'll use this one even on the larger wounds because of the higher hormone content. In terms of taking it off, the putty products will come away as the tree heals beneath it, slowly dries out, and it'll start flaking off of its own accord. If the wound hasn't completely closed and healed, it's necessary to use a scalpel or a sharp knife to just trim the edge to expose the cambium of the vascular tissue, and then reapply some fresh paste. It does dry out, so it's not reusable, but yeah, in terms of taking it off, you'll know it'll just fall off. The liquid is much more strong. The liquid is much stronger in its adherence, and so I like to leave it a good 2, maybe even 3 years for the bark underneath to fully mature, because if you peel it off too early, it can take that sort of that skin-like top layer with it as you peel it away. Because it's on smaller wounds, it tends to be less visually obtrusive anyway, so it's kind of, you know, less of a priority. But it does tend to stick a lot stronger, so I leave it longer. I do wonder, I haven't tried this, but I do wonder if taking it off after a lot of rain, and so it's very wet, I wonder if taking it off might be a bit easier then. I'll have to try that. We'll see. What else can I say? I think that's about everything on cut paste. Maybe I should make a more detailed video on how to use it. But for today, that just about covers the basics. Right. Thanks for that question. Next, we've got Sarmat36 over on the Discord server. I bought these 2 dwarf pomegranates, but I'm focusing on the big one. It seems to have a nice base that flares out with a lot of horizontal roots. Before the buds open, I will repot by bare rooting it, putting it in a suitable substrate, and remove the unnecessary roots. Also, the tree is too tall. Should I lower it at the same time as repotting? Should I do any kind of pruning when repotting it? Definitely got some good potential in that pomegranate. I like that. I am jelly. So the first question in that is, should I lower it when I plant it? If you want to develop them, the nabari are the surface roots that you can see that in the finished bonsai stick out above the soil, and it gives this sort of appearance of age, of stability. I'm sure you've seen them on trees. Nabari. Another term for it is root base. I don't like the term root base, because to me that's the base of the roots, but the nabari is at the base of the trunk. I'm being pedantic. I prefer nabari. I don't like using Japanese terms, particularly around beginners, because it can be a little bit esoteric, but it's just such a ubiquitous term that if you're doing bonsai, you're going to come across the term nabari so early in the process. What the hell, we don't have a better word for it. In terms of how deeply you plant the tree in relation to its nabari depends on whether you're happy with the nabari as it is. So if you remove a root from the nabari completely and you're not interested in new roots taking its place nearby, you can expose the nabari. If you're just completely happy with its appearance, have it exposed. In fact, that can be an advantage, because if you're happy with how it looks and you bury the tree deeply, it can encourage more roots to grow in random places and cause new issues that you need to fix in future. In fact, I had that. I buried an elm too deeply. All of the roots that were forming the nabari for some reason died, leaving one root that grew enormous. So I've had to restart the nabari of that one. That was a mistake. So if you're happy with it, expose those roots. The flip side is if you're doing work to the nabari that relies on new roots developing. So maybe you've got a gap and you're hoping to stimulate roots. You need that to be covered by soil and or moss. If you cut a very long, boring, straight root back to roots off the side to encourage, a bit more of more of an interesting appearance, a change of direction and taper. If you cut it off, you need those roots to be covered in order to ensure that they don't dry out in the sun. So yeah, that covers the depth. What else were we asking? Also, the tree is too tall. Should I lower it at the same time as... So should I prune the tree when repotting it? So if you're repotting a tree and you're unsure whether you should prune the branches at the same time, there are sort of two general considerations you need to make. The first, and the overriding consideration, is the species. If you're working on a conifer, I would only do the repot. I wouldn't do any pruning, because the conifer is going to need all of those needles in order to power the regeneration of roots. If you prune the branches and the roots at the same time, you're reducing its ability to recover, and it can either hamper and delay recovery for a long time, or the tree can die. So if it's a conifer, only repot or only prune in one given sitting until it's had a chance to recover. If we're working on broadleaf, we've got a bit more flexibility. The other facet you need to consider is the health of the tree. If you're repotting because the tree has root issues and is struggling, do not prune any foliage. The more you prune, the less resources the tree has to recover. It's got very little energy stored on board because it's struggling to make roots. It hasn't grown much, it's unhealthy, it's got pests, whatever. If it's unhealthy, only do the repot. If it's unhealthy and doesn't have root issues, I wouldn't even repot. I'd address the issues before attempting to repot. If we're working on a broadleaf and it's a healthy plant, the next question is, how much work can I do all in one go and have the tree survive? Now there's a common trope in bonsai where people say you either kill it or make it bonsai. And what they mean by that is, if you've got a plant, if you've got some material and you need to do a bunch of work to it, do everything that's necessary to give it the best start as bonsai, because that plant is never going to be as vigorous and healthy as it is right now, growing in this beautiful big pot with foliage everywhere, and it's got loads of energy on board. It's never going to have the ability to recover from drastic work to the extent that it does right now. So do everything that you need to do, because it becomes harder as the tree is as the tree matures. It becomes harder to get these big moves out the way. So the kill it or make it bonsai trope has some validity, but it's not the philosophy that I adhere to or encourage. My philosophy is to keep it alive and make it bonsai, rather than kill it or make it bonsai. And people will say, like, when you're learning, you have to kill a few trees in order to figure out where the boundaries are in terms of how much you can do. But So my response to that is that it's better to do less work than you can get away with, and then observe how the plant reacts to know next time, and if that scenario comes up again in the future, I could have done more. Or if the plant bursts into growth and is like, yeah, let's do this, you're like, oh, well, you know, maybe next time in a similar situation I could have done more work and got away with it. Or if it's really slow and just sort of sits there for a year, you think, oh, maybe I was a bit harsh. In the future I'll do less. I think it's important to have respect for the plant material that we work. It's a living thing. It's not just muse for our artistic endeavors. We have to respect this thing. No matter how humble that plant is, it's still a plant that is allowing us to indulge our creative side. It's taking part in this exchange. We're making it look how we want it to look in exchange for giving it a cushy lifestyle. You need to respect that it's a two-way street. You're not smashing the plant and hoping it survives in order to make the best bonsai as quickly as possible because we're full of ego and we want to show off to our mates. That's not my philosophy at all. My philosophy is work with the plant, respect the plant. You'll have a much more rewarding experience rather than doing it for clout. Ooh, bit controversial maybe. So let's be more specific then. How much can you get away with? How do you judge how much root to remove, how many branches to remove, and what the relationship is? Again, we're assuming that the plant is healthy. If it's not healthy, do one or the other. If it's a conifer, do one or the other. Prune the roots or prune the branches. Don't do both at the same time. If it's a broadleaf and it's healthy, how do you know how many roots to prune and how much branches you can prune at the same time? So it's kind of like, if you imagine it like a sliding scale between, at one end we've got maximum pruning of the branches, at the other end we've got maximum pruning of the roots. And where you sit on this sliding scale, so like if you do maximum pruning, if you do like a massive chop, you might choose to do less work on the roots. If you've done a massive root pruning, you might choose to do less. You might choose to cut less off in the branches. Now, inside of this sort of sliding scale, you have to understand that there are species that are less sensitive. They're species that are like, oh no, scissors! He's going to touch our roots. Oh no! Don't prune a single bud. Oh my, I'm healthy, but I'm just so fickle. And then you've got species that are like, heck yeah, cut everything off. I love this. I don't need limbs. I don't need roots. Yeah, let's do this. And you put me in soil and I go back. I'll be huge. I'll go mad. And it's like the more you cut off, the more I like it. Give it to me. Get the saw, get the chainsaw, set me on fire. Yeah. Like field maples and tridents are an example of that. If they're healthy, gosh, you can do some work to them. Just because the plant can respond really strong doesn't mean you have to go bananas. And the more you get used to these techniques, and you're able to rake out the soil without ripping all the roots too much. As you get better at this and you get experience, you can judge how far you can push it. Even with these very tolerant species. But as a general guideline, when you're starting out, think of that slider between pruning the branches versus the roots, and think about where you need to sit on that scale. The more you do up top, the less you do at bottom. The more you do at the bottom, the less you do at the top. That'll see you very, very well, I promise you. Yeah, just looking at the pictures, that sort of left-hand trunk or sub-trunk, it's kind of straight and it goes on for ages, and it's got plenty of side shoots. I'd cut that back to a side shoot and then bare root it. There's plenty of extension growth. It's clearly healthy. I'm not worried about doing quite a lot of work to that pomegranate. Probably wouldn't do a massive chop and leave no new buds. I'd still leave side shoots, but yeah, go for it. Okay, so question on the Discord server. from Shorten Ginger. I have a large number of bigger bonsai that are works in progress, but would like to start to develop some Shohin sized trees, English oak, hornbeam, mugo pine are what I have available to me. Where to start? What proportions should I be looking at? If I want an 8-inch, 20cm tree, how wide should the trunk pot be? It's a new world to me. Thank you. All right, cool. So yeah, this is a pretty big subject. There's a lot of sort of sub questions in there. So I'll do my best to answer the questions generally, but again, it's something that's a very deep topic, and so there's probably a lot more that I'm not going to cover. So let's just remind myself what some of those questions were. Where to start and what proportions. So for a tree to be suitable for training as a Shohin tree, which is sort of, generally speaking, is roughly that sort of size, you need to first of all understand that if there are no branches and buds in this region, it's going to be difficult to train it as a Shohin at that moment. If it's a species that readily back buds, you can do some drastic pruning and you'll get buds lower down. Or if it's a tree that can be grafted, you might, have to do some grafts. There are species that simply will not produce buds down here if all the foliage is way out the top, and so they're just not going to be suitable. Pines can. If there's no foliage close in with pines, you can bend them or you can attempt to get back buds. But the thicker the bark becomes lower down, the less chance you've got of successfully stimulating back buds. So as starting material, if you can kind of see a tree in this sort of height already, it may not look like a bonsai, but if you've got, some kind of foliage closer in, that's a great start. The proportions of the trunk, there's this sort of, I mentioned it in a previous video, but there's this notion of the 1:6 ratio of trunk thickness to ultimate height. It's just a guideline. You can have sort of much thinner. So I don't know what that would be for 8 inches. Let's just do the calculation, shall we? What's 8 divided by 6? 8 divided by 6 equals... so if you're talking inches, we've got 1.3 roughly trunk diameter to an 8-inch tree. What does that work out to be? I don't know, let's say... I'm engaged in talking mode, I can't do maths. 21 divided by 6 is 3.5 centimeters. So if your trunk's approximately 3.5 centimeters, that lends itself to an approximately 20 centimeter tall tree. You could have a thicker trunk, and that creates more of a powerful image. You could have a thinner trunk, and that would be a more sort of a softer, more flowing style trunk, where you emphasize the lines rather than the power. So it's just a guideline. All of the aesthetic principles that apply to bigger trees also apply to the smaller trees in the same way. It's just that you're scaling the proportions. So as the height reduces, the width reduces. In terms of the width of the pot, this is an aesthetic choice. A lot of Shohin sized pots tend to be around 15-16 centimeters wide, 6 inches. And the depth of the pot that you choose depends on your ability to keep them watered and how much growth you want to encourage, and indeed like the species tolerance for shallowness versus depth. If I remember rightly, all of the species you mentioned do prefer a bit of depth to their pot. That doesn't mean you have to go super deep. It just means don't go for these like 3 centimeter deep pots. We've got oak, hornbeam and mugo pine. Yeah, all of those like to be sort of 5, 6, 7 centimeters deep. What's that, 2, maybe 3 inches? I wouldn't go below 1.5 inches for those species personally. And sort of the width, again, depends on the feel of the tree and the width of the canopy. If you've got a sort of, if you want like a wider tree, you might go for a wider pot. If you want to emphasize the elegance, you go for a narrower pot. You just got to have a play, really. Like I said earlier in regards to pot selection, you could write a whole book and still not cover everything to do with pots. A lot of Shohin sized trees are started from air layers, because that gives you control over where the first branch is, any interesting trunk. And nursery trees also offer good Shohin opportunities because they tend to be sort of, if you choose wisely, you'll have approximately 2, 3, 4 centimetre thick trunk, and that lends itself ideally to the Shohin size. If you like Shohin, the DIY Bonsai Challenge is ideal because this is roughly the sort of size ballpark I'm going to be making trees, simply because that's the most available material for beginners. And because they're shorter, you have to spend less time developing a huge trunk and all sorts of branches. You've got fewer branches to make. So yeah, follow along the DIY Bonsai Challenge if you want to know more, because that is exactly what I'll be demonstrating as I go. On to the next question. We've got Elna Weinhard, who asked a question via the Facebook group. I have 2 Japanese maples. From the red one with fine leaves, I successfully got an air layer, but the yellow one with slightly broader leaves just refuses to cooperate. What could be the reason? So with air layers, there is no guarantee of success. First of all, sometimes for unexpected reasons, it just won't root. Having said that, there are also several known issues that could also be contributing. So the first thing to consider is that although Japanese maple as a species air layers fairly easily, there are varieties that will not root from air layer, or will rarely, or are much more difficult to root via the layer process. I don't have an encyclopedia knowledge of all the varieties and how well they root, because I've only grown a few myself. So I'm not going to comment about whether your particular variety does struggle, because I simply don't know, but genetics can be a thing. Another issue is the general health and vigour of the plant being air layered, or even the health of the individual branch on the tree that's being air layered. If it's particularly shaded, it might not be very vigorous, so that can contribute. Obviously, the healthier and the more energy that the tree has, the more energy that the more light and energy that the individual branch you're air layering has, the more likely you are to be successful. The inverse of that is if the plant isn't healthy, the chances of getting roots from your layer are greatly diminished. So if you're intending to air layer, it's a good idea to really get that tree as pumped and healthy as you possibly can before placing that air layer. It will greatly increase your chances. That may be a larger pot, more attentive watering, better light conditions, and a good healthy dose of fertilizer throughout the year prior to placing the air layer. Another issue is with the technique. So when we do the air layer, and I've got another video on the issues and how to fix them, but when we do an air layer by doing a ring bark, where you take a ring of bark away, place some substrate, some rooting medium in position. If you leave some amount of cambium tissue on the wound, it can regrow vascular tissue and allow the energy that the tree produces in the form of carbohydrates to bridge the gap, sending nutrients and energy back down to the roots and telling the tree, I've been wounded, but I don't need to produce roots. That can prevent success. Similarly, if the gap between the top of the wound and the bottom of the wound is very short, as the callus tissue develops, it can bridge the gap and have exactly the same effect. If the branch above the air layer can send nutrients back to the roots, the hormonal message is disrupted and the chances of getting roots aren't zero. It still can happen, but they are greatly reduced. So it's important to go deep enough, not too deep, because that can hamper water going upwards from the roots, but deep enough and cleanly enough so that all of the cambium tissue is removed and the gap is large enough to reduce the likelihood of bridging. Some people say twice the thickness of the branch, but the thickness of the branch actually isn't relevant. It's the amount of callus tissue that that species or that variety is capable of producing that's relevant. So I like to give sort of, I don't know, 3, 4, maybe even 5 or 6 centimeters if the species is particularly vigorous. Another issue is the conditions within the rooting medium. So I find that if the medium is particularly dense and wet and holds moisture throughout, the chance of creating roots in my climate goes down rapidly. I have much better success using a granular substrate suspended in a pot than I do with moss almost sealed into a ball. Now there are people that have had far more success at air layers that do use a tightly wrapped moss ball to and they get tremendous results with all sorts of species that I have yet to have success with. It's just in my particular garden, it's very wet. We get a lot of rain towards the west of the UK, and I find that moss stays wet and we get loads and loads of callus produced at the wound, but no roots. When I swap the wet moss out for a drier area granular substrate, boom, roots come like crazy. Are there any other potential pitfalls? I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but do check out that video as I go into a lot more detail. Some of the diagrams I've perhaps chosen colours unwisely, but they are anatomically accurate in the sense of the layers where they sit. Have a look at those, and I do talk about more of the issues in depth. Okay, so another question from Elna Weinhard. I have a group of native bonsai to be trees. They are outdoors and I'm always in doubt when to start pruning them. Especially when I have only one of a certain species, I'm afraid to kill them. That's a great question. Love that question. So at the very most fundamental level, we only want to prune trees that are healthy. How do we know that they're healthy? The foliage is clean, it's intact. If the foliage, if it's spring or the foliage has fallen for the dormancy, the buds are nice, juicy, they're plentiful. It's not just one tiny little bud on the end of each branch. It grew well that season. The extensions are decent relative to the refinement of the tree. So if the tree is a bonsai to be or pre-bonsai, we would like to see nice long extensions, plenty of buds, maybe the internode, maybe the distance between each bud is relatively long, signs that the tree is healthy. If in a growing pot the extensions are very small or haven't extended at all, or the foliage has some kind of pest or disease, we would probably choose not to prune, and we would allow that tree to grow and build up some momentum and some energy and some vigor before we consider doing the prune. If the tree is healthy and has lots of energy and is growing lots, if it's in a more refined pot, that growth might be shorter and thinner, but there's plenty of it and the buds and the foliage have been healthy, then we would consider pruning. So the next topic within this area is the timing of the prune. Very generally speaking, there's one time that it's absolutely imperative that we do not prune, and that's when the spring growth has started, the tree's pushing all of its energy into producing this first flush of growth of the year after the winter, and it's made an investment into this growth. It's pushed its energy reserves into this growth because it wants to grow more leaves and it wants to get ready for the summer and all the sunlight and beautiful air and whatnot to regain some even more energy to grow even more shoots for the future. But while it's in that soft new growth period, almost everything it's got has been pushed into that. So if we prune at that time, we are taking away the energy of the tree before we've given it a chance to regain some of its investment. Now, there are times where I say we never prune during this period. There are times in more of the sort of the later stages of bonsai training where we might consider to do some pinching work, do some work to the tree at this time to really control the growth and the amount of energy that it's got. But this is the later, more advanced stages of bonsai. When we're working on pre-bonsai, the rule stands. You let it grow through the spring season. You wait for that foliage to mature. It'll go from feeling very soft and fleshy to waxy. That's when the leaves are mature. They're at their most efficient at converting that sunlight to energy. And the plant has started to take some of that energy and recoup what it's invested in this growth. Once it's had a week or two to sort of build some energy, after those first 3, 4, 5, 6 leaves have started to harden, that's our first window to do some pruning work, with the confidence of knowing that it's regained its energy and can react to our pruning in a positive way without the risk of dieback or death. The window of opportunity for pruning is open sort of through until late summer. If we prune sort of too close before the autumn/fall period sets in, we can weaken the tree going into the winter. Or on the other hand, what can happen is the tree has the risk of putting out another flush of growth in response to our pruning work, and that flush of growth doesn't have the time, it doesn't have the sort of the intensity of sun to regain some of the energy that it pushes into that growth before it gets ready for dormancy. So sort of when we're getting sort of towards the middle of August, late August, generally speaking, it's time to pause. There are exceptions. There are many conifers that can be worked in this period. Tropical trees, they're also an exception. But generally speaking, towards the end of summer, we wait. Then, when the tree begins dormancy, the deciduous leaves have the last few straggly deciduous leaves have fallen, and we've got this sort of 2-week window. We can do some more pruning where it won't interfere with the tree's ability to become winter hardy. Through the winter, the winter period is a grey area because you can prune and do work on your trees, but you have to understand that to a degree the winter hardiness, having done that pruning work, is decreased. So if you prune in the middle of winter when the tree isn't able to react, you do somewhat reduce its winter hardiness. And that, for a very energetic tree with lots of energy, that's probably not going to be a problem. But as you start to get towards the more refined bonsai state of energy, you have to be sort of a little bit more careful. Or maybe you've got some species that are on the edge of their tolerance of the climate. That pruning work might be, you might just choose to wait till spring. Winter's a grey area. You just have to know that if you do work, there are sort of increased risks. But the general takeaway is, if your tree is healthy, you can do pruning whenever and they'll be fine. But it's best to stick to those windows in order to get the very best out of the response that the tree produces. But let's get on to the next question. Milan, so apologies if my pronunciation is off here. Milan Domaini says, if you do collecting trees, brackets yamadori, could you talk about your approach, autumn/spring collecting, aftercare? I am struggling with Hawthorn yamadori. Hawthorns here have really big taproots and little feeders at the base. Until now, my 2 attempts have failed. I am using black bag method. This autumn I tried autumn collecting for the first time. I placed my tree to unheated basement into black bag and 2 roots actually coming of the trunk, which gives me some hope. Okay, so I have to prefix this with saying I'm not a yamadori collector. So the experience that I'm going to pass on to you is either second-hand info that I've not tried myself, or it's based on my experiences digging material from gardens and more domesticated environments. So the first thing I would say is you're familiar with the black bag method, which makes me think you've done a fair amount of research into the approaches of people like Tony Tickle, Harry Harrington, and the way that they're rehabilitating their yamadori. I certainly don't have anything more to add on that other than to reiterate that the ideal conditions for generating roots are warmth to the root system, but not necessarily to the upper reaches of the plant. So bottom heat can help. High humidity, which reduces the transpiration, and therefore what few roots the tree does have are able to cope with supplying water to the leaves so that you don't essentially dry the plant out. I know that Rhizotonic is a product that is particularly successful at stimulating hawthorn roots, and I've seen that myself. I've seen firsthand hawthorn produce roots up in the air as a response to a heavy and repetitive application of Canna's Rhizotonic product. It's not snake oil, it's not a placebo. It definitely works. I've seen it myself. So that can help. Then we start to look at the the actual collection process. You say that they tend to have thick, dominant tap roots and little fine roots around the base of the trunk. I think in this scenario, we have to accept that in its current condition, when the material has this configuration of roots, if you like, that it's unethical to attempt to dig it up. This may be controversial. I'm not anti-yamadori, don't get me wrong, but there are times where you have to accept that the risk of survival is so low that it's actually a waste of time, energy, and the life of the plant to attempt to collect it. Does that mean that it's uncollectible forever? No. So what can we do to enhance our chances? First, you can dig a trench around the tree, which essentially prunes any roots that are in the area. When those roots are pruned, they are more likely to stimulate more roots nearer the trunk and indeed from the trunk as a response to the pruning. In much the same way as when we trim the branches, we get new shoots. The roots behave exactly the same. Another option could be to, again, I haven't tried this, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, could be to perform the dig, have a look at what the roots look like, and wound the taproot, replace the soil, in the hopes that new roots will form closer to, the base of the trunk and make it more collectible at a future date in a year or 2 years' time. The practicality of that, I don't know. Maybe something to consider. I don't have a lot of other advice really. It's, if a tree doesn't have very many fine feeder roots close in and it's just one taproot, you have to accept that it's going to be difficult. Maybe pass or take steps to try and stimulate roots before you do the dig. Maybe even dosing it with Rhizotonic for a year or two to see if you can get more roots closer in. Other than that, study the advice of Tony Tickle and co. If you've got, just another thing that's sprung to mind. Does the basement have light? And by light, I mean daylight rather than some light bulbs. The light, even when trees don't have leaves, they're able to photosynthesize. So having light is important. If it's a dark basement, that could be a major issue. A greenhouse or just some kind of clear plastic and placing the tree outdoors when temperatures allow, much more reasonable. Obviously you can't let them freeze, that drastically affects the survivability. Yeah, that's all I've got. Good luck. Then from what I've been told, they're not the easiest of species to collect. Let us know how you get on, let us know what you try. I'd love to see what works, what doesn't work. All right, I hope that helps. Let's move on to the next question, which is from Nigel Stringer. I'm afraid I forget where this comes from, probably Facebook group. What is the right choice of pot to suit your tree? So this is a huge topic. I'm certainly not going to be able to cover everything in this in this Q&A format. This deserves not just its own video, but its own book. But the considerations for choosing a pot. First of all, you need to ask yourself, am I happy with my tree where it's at developmentally? Or is there more significant work to be done? And by significant work, what I'm talking about is the trunk. Is the trunk thick enough? Have you got it to a stage where you're ready to start thinking about building the branches? If you're happy with the trunk, then moving towards a smaller container might be the right step. If you're developing the tree, if you're thickening the trunk, you've got big wounds to heal, you've just done a chop and you're creating a new leader, a bigger pot is the right choice. So you might choose a nursery container, which is deeper. Some people use wooden containers for their developing material. If it's really early in the process, you might even plant them in the ground. But as your tree starts to get to a stage where you're happy with the essential structure, we're starting to look at the bonsai container. Now this is where it gets much more subjective, but there are some sort of guidelines that we can follow to help make the choice easier. The first is the depth of the container. There are some species that are particularly sensitive in the root zone to very shallow containers. They need to have a little bit of depth, particularly under the trunk, for various reasons. It's all to do with the horticulture, how the roots behave, the temperature fluctuations, the moisture content of the soil. Certain species like azalea, hornbeam can be sensitive and need a deeper pot. Pines, larch, they like more of a cool root system, so a deeper pot can be beneficial, although they can be grown in shallower containers. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got your maples and similar species that can tolerate very, very shallow pots. Generally speaking though, the deeper the pot, the easier it is to keep them healthy and watered. You've then got the width of the pot. Aesthetically, the width and the depth of the pot are related. The narrower the pot in relation to the size of the tree, the deeper you might consider going. On the other end of the scale is if you go wider, you can go shallower, bearing in mind the horticultural constraints. Inside of that, we've got ovals, we've got round shapes, and we've got rectangular pots. There are also freeform pots, and whether you choose to go for more of a freeform, rugged, or a rock style is something that you'll judge with the tree. It generally tends to be a very artistic choice. But in terms of the difference between round, rectangle, and oval, you look at the characteristics of the tree and decide what characteristics you want to emphasize or contrast. If the tree is very tall, elegant, and slim, and the foliage mass tends to be off to one side, you might consider going for a rounder pot. A round pot can really emphasize the flow of the trunk, and it can also sort of highlight the asymmetry in terms of the foliage being off to one side and the pot being central. It can have a very dramatic effect. Then when we've got elegant feeling trees where the main foliage mass tends to be above the centre of the trunk or near the centre of the trunk, so not dramatically off to one side, then we would look at an oval pot, which tends to emphasise the flowing lines of the trunk. Maybe we've got an informal upright or a very soft feeling design. The oval pot might be the right choice. Finally, for very powerful trees where the main foliage mass is above or near the centre of the trunk, and they've got very thick, and the trunk's got a very thick base and it tapers dramatically, or maybe we've got loads of powerful looking dramatic deadwood, then the rectangular pot might be the more appropriate selection. The more grounded it feels, the more powerful and present you want the pot to look. That's the most I've talked for a long time. Then the discussion starts to be glazes and finishes. Do we go unglazed? Do we go for a texture? What colour of glaze? Very generally speaking, we tend to choose unglazed pots for conifers and sometimes, but not always, broadleaf. They can, there's a bit of a grey area there, and we tend to choose glazed for deciduous broadleaf and, depending on how we feel, the broadleaf evergreens. This is just a general aesthetic guide. Playing with the exceptions is where the fun lies. But as sort of a whistle-stop introduction, there you have it. I hope that helps. I think that might be the last question. If you have questions, you can either comment below here and I'll try and respond, but I prioritise either the Discord server or the Facebook group, and I'll put links down in the chat, in the comments below. Come and join us in the DIY challenge. It's supposed to be fun and a good way to get started in bonsai. It's not a massive ego fest. We're all here to help, share ideas. It's not about proving who knows the most, It's about enjoying and getting started and getting in nature, working with our plants and respecting our plants and respecting each other. So if that sounds appealing, hit those links, come and join. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.